Sian Heder, you wrote and directed the film CODA, which is about the child of deaf adults who wants to pursue music. And it's based on a French film from 2014. So what about that film resonated with you when you were approached to adapt it for an American film?
I think it was the character at the center. I mean, I think the CODA experience is a very unique experience. Oftentimes CODAs are raised within deaf culture. ASL is their first language. They really, feel a part of the community. They are a part of the community, and yet they're hearing people who then sort of have to be a bridge between two different cultures. Oftentimes, interpreting for their parents and just sort of trying to navigate being a part of two different worlds, but also kind of a part of neither. And there's a lot of inherent tension in that that's very dramatic and interesting. And so there was a lot in that character that I thought had incredible potential, and to deepen what had been started with the French film and to really find my own film within that story that could be personal and feel like I could imbue it with all these other things. And then honestly, just a chance to explore deaf culture in a very deep way. It struck me when I saw that film how rarely I had ever seen deaf characters on screen. And in the French film, the actors playing the parents are both hearing. So there couldn't be an exploration really of the language or culture in a way that I felt like the story was asking for. And so I don't know, I was intrigued by the fact that like when I tried to go look for movies that had deaf characters in them, I was going back 35 years to Children of a Lesser God. And it just seemed crazy that this is the most cinematic language in existence. It's a purely visual language that is begging to be on screen. And that the culture, the community, these characters had not been seen before. So I think it was that. And it was also like, I don't think I would have embarked upon it if I didn't think I could truly make my own movie that would feel like mine and feel like it had a reason to exist outside of the original film. So tonally, they're very different. I never used the script from the original film. I watched the film once and then I sort of absorbed the story and then, embarked on my own journey with it. And then I wrote it for a place that I loved, which was Gloucester, Massachusetts. And I grew up in Cambridge. And we would go up to Gloucester every summer of my life. And I knew the fishing community there and had watched this working class town fall apart really when the fishing industry died. And, people were struggling to figure out what to do when they couldn't make a living anymore. And so that also felt like a very ripe setting for a story and conflict within this family.
Since it's a story about deaf characters, largely deaf characters played by deaf actors, and I know you learned some American Sign Language in the process of making this movie. How's that writing process different when you're writing a film? As you said, it's the most cinematic language. It's very visual as opposed to what you can hear. How is that a different writing process, or is it different?
Oh, it's hugely different. Well, because it didn't start out different. So yes, it is the most cinematic language, but it also has no written form. So there's no way to write down ASL. There's ASL gloss, which is kind of a form of notation where you're sort of using English words as labels for certain signs and drawing diagrams and pictures, but there's no way to express the language on the page that eventually exists on the screen. So when I wrote in English, and I wrote the way that I've written every script, where I'm sort of, talking out loud to myself and playing every part and really hearing the characters, because obviously I'm a hearing person. English is my language. That's kind of how I'm approaching these characters, is really hearing their voices come alive. I mean, I even heard like the Boston accents because I'm from that area. So I kind of was like in the world of these fishermen and these characters. And then there was definitely a point in the writing where I was like, oh, this is a dumb way to work, because I'm never going to hear these lines. These jokes are not going to be dependent on the rhythm of a punchline or the way something's delivered. This is really the unknown for me. And so in a way, that initial script that I wrote was like a launching pad, where I was like, okay, this is where we're starting. And then there's going to be this massive exploration as we kind of discover the language. And 50% of the dialogue is in ASL. So in a way, it was just like this leap of like, this is where I'm starting. This is where these characters are coming to life for me as three-dimensional, complicated, flawed people. Now we need to discover who they are kind of within this language. So I had two ASL masters or directors of ASL, Alexandria Wales and Ann Tomasetti. And both of them are deaf women and they're artists themselves, and they have extensive theater backgrounds. And so the first time I met with Alexandria, we went like line by line through the script, every piece of dialogue, and we would go back and forth and discuss, and she would show me possible sign choices. And at that point, I had been studying ASL, so I was not fluent, but I was conversational. And recently we both realized that we met the first time without an interpreter. And I think about like, we spent 5 hours just like dissecting the script, and neither of us had remembered that there was no interpreter there, because I think we were so focused on the material. And she would really discuss the meaning of every line. So in a way, it forced me to excavate my own script in a way that you don't normally do as a writer until you're on set with your actors. What does the character want and what's the intention behind this? And she would sign the line back to me, and then we would kind of discuss, or sometimes I needed a sign that felt emotionally different, so we would play with different signs. And then she was making some videos and recording in ASL gloss, but mostly keeping it in her mind and her body, which was this incredible sense of trust I had to give over, where I'm like, okay, you're holding this, all of my words in this way. And then the actors showed up, and of course they have their own ways of signing. And, Marley has a very different signing style than Daniel and than Troy. And so a lot of work went into, and Amelia was new to signing. So then there was kind of this work to make everybody feel like a cohesive family and find the local signs. It's like, what's the name sign for Gloucester? And like the town has this name, which is like a little G in the air, but we didn't know that till we got there and we're talking to locals, the deaf community there. So it was this amazing thing where, and Troy is just the most inventive signer you've ever seen in your life. So any joke that I wrote, he would take off with, and, his signs would go so far past what I'd written, in the sex talk or whatever, where he's kind of, things that can't even be subtitled because they're just so creative and visual. So the script was a really amazing thing, because in a way it was a document to start with, but it could never be the document of the thing, because the language only exists in a visual space. So that was a really amazing, people talk about that feeling as a writer where you watch your words come to life. And this was the most literal form of that there was. You're watching your words transform into a kind of expression that is solely physical and much more expressive than spoken English. So that was cool as well. And then to work with Amelia, who was as new to the language as I was, and having the two of us really live in a space on set where ASL became the mode of communication. So that's how I was communicating with my actors. That's how Amelia was communicating with her co-stars. And then the crew started to take part in that. So it just became the dominant culture on set as well, which was a really beautiful thing to watch.
Well, I want to congratulate you on the film and your work on it, and we will have you back on in a little bit to join our group chat.
Awesome.
A pleasure talking to you. Roberto Bentivegna, your screenwriter for House of Gucci, which tells the true story of the deadly inner battles in that fashion empire. Now, a movie about the Gucci family, that drama has been in the works for a while. So how did the project come your way?
Well, it's interesting because it was sort of the perfect marriage of personal experience and something that, as you say, has been sort of in the public eye for many years. I grew up in Milan, and my mother's a fashion designer, and I used to play 2 doors down from where Maurizio Gucci was murdered. So I knew the story just by osmosis. And I remember reading throughout the years of different developments with the project, with different actors, different directors. And I just thought to myself, wow, if I could do something like that, like if I had a dream project, could it be this one, And so I met Ridley and Janina. We talked very generally, actually, about it. We didn't have like a super specific take on it. My main thing was that I really wanted it to be almost like a fashion noir or like a fashion gangster film. I feel like the world of fashion has not really been explored in film very successfully. I think I was traumatized by Pret-a-Porter, the Robert Altman movie, who I adore, but not his greatest film. And so this was really an opportunity to kind of do it justice, do the world of fashion justice, tell a story. I said last night, it was like, what if Sunset Boulevard was told from Norma Desmond's perspective, So kind of switching that dynamic around. And Patrizia is such a filmic character in real life. She's so cinematic that it felt like a very natural kind of progression, to take the events and dramatize them.
The story that you're telling is, spans so many years, decades, so many characters involved. What were the challenges of distilling all of that into a cohesive, clear story?
The main thing was really telling the story from Patrizia's point of view and centering the narrative around her in a way that essentially she was the architect of the drama that happens within the family, and some of that was factual, and a lot of that was dramatic license. But it was very important to have a through line and to create a sense of dramatic progression that felt almost like a Scarface or sort of a Warner Brothers gangster movie, where you're with the character as they rise and you're emotionally invested in them. And then, of course, the fall comes with that kind of pathos and emotional investment. And the other thing was just to go through a lot of articles from the 1970s that recounted the family and the sort of the turbulence of the family, and just pick moments and details and little things that I could build on. Something as simple as Paolo Gucci's fascination with pigeons. He was the chairman of the Pigeon Lovers Association. And I just love the idea that his character was almost like a pigeon, that he thought of himself as this kind of dove, this beautiful dove, but actually he couldn't fly, and so taking that and building that into the character was very helpful. And so it was a lot of those little details from real life that I could then really run with.
And so much of the story, is very much about the corporate intrigue, behind the scenes at Gucci. What work went into kind of conveying and understanding, and all of that, all of those business dynamics that play in such a dramatic way in the film?
Well, I have to confess, I'm very bad with business and with finance, so I had to keep it simple for myself because I wouldn't understand it as an audience member, and I wouldn't find it particularly interesting. So for me, it was a question of killing off 2 of the family members, because Guccio I think he had 3 sons and 2 daughters, 3 sons and a daughter. And so it was a question of just kind of limiting it to Rodolfo and Aldo and giving them 2 sons to really kind of create like a square, and making sure that the business was quite simple. The drama was the most important part of it, was the betrayals and the double crossings, and just keeping it incredibly streamlined without kind of dwelling in the business.
And with so many larger than life characters in the story, in addition to Patrizia, did you have particular favorites who just digging into those characters was the most satisfying?
Yeah, well, I think Paolo, I love his arc, and I love his his mediocrity, or at least the fact that he thinks he's brilliant, but he's actually quite mediocre. And I think there's something about that dramatically that's very, actually quite moving. Like there's something about him that's quite touching. And the way that Jared played it, I thought was beautiful, and almost like a character from an opera, sort of the tragic buffoon. And that moment at the end of his fashion show when he walks out on stage and he weeps is Pagliacci. It's just beautiful. So I would say I love them all, but I mean, if I had to pick one, I'd probably say him.
What do you hope that, because, this event, these events happened, the murder took place in the 90s. Like, what do you hope people take from this story now, and the themes that you hope to kind of convey? Well,
I think, it's not, it's an amoral tale, or it's almost like a Shakespearean tragedy in that sense. The obvious answer is, be careful what you wish for, but I think generally these tales, I think it's more a question of sort of going through the journey of these characters and these very flawed human beings, and not necessarily sort of taking an easy answer out of it, but rather just enjoying and exploring the shades of the moral landscape of the family, which, even though it is a very eccentric family, there are things within that are very relatable. The father who doesn't want his son to marry a specific daughter, or the Paolo who doesn't feel loved by his dad or doesn't feel respected by his family. I think all of those themes could be applied to really any context in any country.
Were there any, elements of this story as you were working to kind of streamline it into the film that you wish you could have explored more, or wish you could have included that, darlings you had to kill along the way in the writing process?
Well, yeah, the original draft opened with the Gucci factory being flooded because in the 1950s, I believe, the Arno River in Florence overflooded. And I had this sequence where this tide just washes through the atelier, and there's leather everywhere floating, and the portrait of Guccio is like sinking, and it was sort of like this very visual idea, obviously, of the tide that's gonna run over the family. I thought it was pretty cool, but that was really the only thing, because otherwise I was very lucky that the script is exactly the film is exactly what I wrote, and we didn't really have to cut anything out. At one point, the longest draft I think was 150 pages, which is massive. So yeah, we did have to sort of trim here and there, but I never felt like I sacrificed anything particularly important. Obviously, everything is important, but I didn't lose the essence of anything.
Well, congratulations on the film, and thank you so much for joining me to talk about it. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Fran Kranz, you wrote and directed Mass, which is the story of two pairs of parents still in the middle of their grieving in the aftermath of a school shooting. And it's your feature writing and directing debut. So what inspired you to tell this particular story?
Well, I was a new parent at the time of the Parkland shooting, and February 2018. And I was pretty overwhelmed by the event, and in ways that I hadn't been before in the past, with some of these shootings and these tragedies that happen with some frequency in our country. And I was deeply affected by this, and I sort of quickly sort of assumed it was because I was a new parent, but it was a little confusing as well, and I kind of felt this need to look deeper into it and why I was so rattled by it. So I started, buying books and doing research about the subject. And over these sort of the next couple months, I started to make these other kind of realizations about my life and sort of things I had always been interested in or fascinated by or inspired by. And going back into when I was a teenager and in high school and college, learning about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and the stories that came out of the amnesty hearings there, bringing families of victims with perpetrators or even meeting families of the perpetrators in this effort of restorative justice to sort of heal and reconcile and move forward as a country, not live with this continued kind of pain and resentment. And I thought it was incredible, but I thought also that I did not know how or if I could participate in something like that. At that age, I thought, no, I would need retribution. I would need punishment. And these things kind of circled back, I guess, as a new parent some 20 years later, in the wake of these shootings, or particularly what happened at Parkland. I started to think about those things again and what would happen and what would happen in my life, and what would I do? And so I started focusing on these meetings. I found these meetings of these parents meeting one another, families of victims and families of perpetrators. And it became clear to me that I wanted to tell a story about pain and how we live with it, but also what we can do with it. What do we do with it, and how do we move forward with it? So that long answer, but that's kind of the genesis of the film.
What's interesting about it from a storytelling perspective is that you have the story that takes place in this one room for the most part with these parents, but they're discussing so much of events that took place before that led them to that point. Like, how much outlining, and sort of backstory building were you doing before you could even get to the writing of those characters in that room? Like, was that a lot of pre-preparation?
I mean, a lot of research. I mean, I really tried to immerse myself in true accounts. These, real efforts of restorative justice. The TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. You can find real transcripts, and but a big source for me was Desmond Tutu's book, No Future Without Forgiveness. And then there's the Forgiveness Project, which you'll get a lot more details or actual things people say to one another in these situations. The meetings between parents in the wake of these shootings are very private, obviously. There's not a great amount of detail. So I tried to really immerse myself in real accounts. Meanwhile, I was doing this other kind of research, just about shootings in America and abroad. And, the subject of the movie, what I really was interested in is how you get through a conversation like this and what is that conversation. So it was always important to me. It was very clear from the beginning. It has to be real time. It has to be uninterrupted. I didn't want flashbacks. I didn't want music and, inserts, or I didn't want to be poetic about it. I wanted to sort of embrace the awkwardness and difficulty of real life and the challenges that would present. And in the sense that we're going to enter this room with them, and we're not going to leave until they leave. And we're going to have to suffer through it, so to speak, and sort of endure the difficult moments. And thinking that, look, life in many ways, in my mind, life seems filled mostly with ordinary moments, and then kind of sprinkled or sometimes interrupted by more extraordinary moments. And so while the meeting is incredibly emotional, I wanted to embrace the ordinary also and tell that story that grief is something that we sort of live with, and we live with it in the ordinary times as well. And so it was important to me to keep this in real time. But also, as far as the information, when you said this takes place 6 years later, or at some time later, and in the film it's 6 years, there was a lot of attention and sort of effort, and a big challenge in the writing process was always trying to make sure or pay attention to what do these people know already, and what would how would that affect what they want to say or what they need to hear or need to say in this room? And so I would, and with each draft, usually catch something to say, well, wait, this guy, they would already know this, I think. So why would he say this? Or if she does know this, then she might interrupt and say, I don't want to hear this. I don't need to hear this. I know that. And so there was, in a lot of edits, there would just be a lot of that. There'd be a lot of interjecting. No, I know this. I don't need to, which I felt sort of added to the kind of naturalism of the conversation, but also the frustration. It was another, getting actors involved to do readings was a huge help in the sense that even as an actor myself, I think you get immersed in the writing process and you can lose track of these things. So it was great to have actors come on board, even just for a read through at someone's home and hear from them. This felt funny to me because wouldn't I know this, or isn't this information one might gather from a police report, or those kind of things. And so it always was this evolving, kind of organic conversation in the sense that finding the truth and the real sort of authenticity of what's known and what's important, I guess.
And this being such a character, an actor-driven film and story, how did your background as an actor kind of affect your writing process, inform it, influence it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how else to do it. I'm so curious to hear, from the other writers, and I obviously Rebecca's an actor, and there was this improvisation, right? And it sounds like listening to them, it's sort of what you do. I guess that's what you do. You sort of live these parts and hear them and visualize them. And so much of it was sort of improvisation. I know as an actor, even when you kind of have, a small role, right? There's no small roles, only small actors, or what they say. And this idea that you create your own backstory, you believe in the person, you're a three-dimensional person. And even if you're the bad guy, I'm not the bad guy, these kind of ideas. So, I wrote particularly the four leads as four protagonists. I really fought their case, so to speak, or really tried to plead their case and give them dignity and speak for them as honestly and as compassionately as I possibly could. And this goes for the parents of the shooters, where that might be perhaps more challenging. I really tried to fight for each of these people, which was a crazy making process, right? Because I would hit obstacles in my own conversation and kind of arguing with myself and not knowing how to sort of, who was right. And that was sort of probably the major challenge of the writing process. And I would just sort of surrender to it and say, you know what, I'm just going to stop here and I'm going to go back to the research. And, I'm really fascinated by this sort of account that I read, or I heard, I read about a family exchanging photographs, and I thought, man, what could that have been like? That I don't know if that's a good idea. That sounds really sensitive and painful. So I would write that out. I would have my characters sort of do that exercise. And I started to have these kind of, puzzle pieces of a conversation. I sort of knew what I wanted this to be in essence. But I started to try and piece together these sort of somewhat separate scenes of dialogue into a larger conversation. And basically embracing or hoping for that in real life, there often are forced segues and difficult conversations. Sometimes you reach impasses and you're not sure how to get through it. And there are awkward silences or contradictions or redundancies, and you sort of push through in an effort to get to a better place, and trying to sort of welcome that difficulty and sculpting the conversation. That was kind of an 11th hour realization in the writing process, where I thought, it's okay if these pieces don't seem to fit. We'll make them fit because these characters would make that effort. They would push through the awkwardness because they're so desperate and feel such urgency in their need to be there and heal and find meaning.
Well, I want to congratulate you on the film, and thank you so much for talking to me about it.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Rebecca Hall, you're the writer and director of Passing, which is about a Black woman in the 1920s, as well as her childhood friend who is passing as white. The novel it's based on was written almost 100 years ago. When did you discover it, and how did it affect you and inspire you?
I discovered it 13 years ago. It was a very specific moment in my life, I think. I was talking more about my own complicated mixed race heritage, and complicated in that it was very shrouded in mystery and hidden. And although I knew snippets from my mother because she experienced incidents of racism growing up in Detroit, she's American, this is my American side, and she knew things about her father, but also didn't know things. And increasingly, I was talking about it to people, and someone around this time handed me the book and said, this thing you're talking about, the reason why it's so mysterious could be something to do with this. And honestly, I remember looking at the book and thinking, passing, what does that even mean? What is that word? But reading the book was, of course, very emotionally galvanizing, but also creatively, because yes, it gave me this context for understanding my own racial identity, for understanding my grandfather, who I now know was Black. His parents were Black. He was racialized Black, but he chose at a certain point to live his life as a white man. And with that comes a huge erasure of my family history. So yes, I had a sort of context and empathy and compassion for him with this book, but also, I don't know, honestly, it sort of gave me a framework from which to think about identity on a larger scale, because ultimately it's about how any of us negotiates how we want to be in the world. It's sort of about the tension between the person that we think we ought to be and the person, because of how society views us or whatever, or various different systems of oppression that you may or may not exist under, and the person that you want to be and how much freedom you have within that. I was struck by its modernity, and I was sort of struck by its universality, honestly. It's an extraordinary piece of fiction that is only 93 pages long, very slim, very economical. But yeah, I can only, the sort of, how it hit me was very forcefully. It was a sort of, I couldn't stop the movie in my head. So in a way, I wrote the first draft of the screenplay as a response to trying to shut off the movie in my head after reading the book. It was that sort of interaction. I wrote the first draft in about 10 days after reading it. Wasn't great. And then I stuck it in a drawer because I was slightly overwhelmed and intimidated by its potential. I was scared I couldn't actually pull it off. I had a lot of big ideas and they seemed a little scary to me. So it sat in a drawer for about 6 years. And then I got it out, tinkered with it and started showing it to people, then spent 7 years trying to get it made.
And before, this being your feature film debut as a writer-director, was this something that you had always wanted to pursue before Passing, or was it really this particular story that galvanized that?
No, I'd always wanted to do it. I think when I was a kid, the people I idolized as a child weren't actors, funnily enough. I mean, I came to acting, found myself to be fairly good at it and to achieve success at it. And that was very rewarding. But when I was a kid, I my heroes were like Alfred Hitchcock and Robert Mitchum, oddly, and also which doesn't count, but I suppose I'm thinking about Night of the Hunter and Charles Lawson. But it was the art of filmmaking that got me into it. That's what I was interested in, and I've always wanted to do that. And I've always been a writer. I've just been a bit quiet about it.
And in this particular story, there's so much happening for these characters internally, where, as a writer, you're trusting your actors and your audience to pick up on subtexts and emotional beats. is that challenging to know when to say something and when to kind of suggest something in the process of telling the story?
It's hugely challenging. It was the challenge of the book. I mean, it's sort of, I mean, the story is really focused on, you know, it's sort of purporting to be about the woman who's hiding her racial identity, but actually it's about that woman's effect on the other woman who's not hiding her racial identity, but is arguably hiding everything else about herself and is crumbling from the inside, but doesn't even know it. And so it was always the problem of the adaptation was how do you show that? I mean, yes, of course you rely on your actors, but at the same time, you've got to give them something, you've got to dramatize something for them to play with. And even the book is so economical. It asks so much of you to do the work. And I wanted the film to have that same quality. So it was a very sort of, it was a constant negotiation of balancing. You know, there were times that you could tip it too far into one interpretation, and then it would be about pulling that back. But a lot of it was also done through, you know, I thought a lot about juxtaposition and antithesis, you know, the sort of idea that you could give Irene a line about feeling safe within the context of her home, but juxtapose that with the woman sitting beside her who is following her literally around the house, and the kids playing a game of cowboys and Indians above her head with a thumping. So you have this sort of dissonance constantly. And, you know, so there was always like a sort of the visual language somehow betraying her subtext without, you know, sort of like her talking whilst in the mirror, and the sort of sense of her visual landscape being untrustworthy. So the audience is slowly let in on the idea that she might be an unreliable witness to the world that we think that we are experiencing through her, and her own sense of her own morally righteousness becomes sketchy.
And speaking of visual language, you shoot the film in black and white. Was that something that you knew from the writing stage that you wanted to do? And if so, was that, you know, how did that influence the writing process, knowing the visual style was going to be that?
Yes, the black and white and the aspect ratio, the sort of constrained putting them in a box thing were all ideas that I had 13 years ago. The black and white it did help the writing, funnily enough, to think of it like that, because I was always thinking of it as being a visual metaphor. And I suppose if your overall mission statement is an abstraction, and you're sort of asking your audience to sort of consider perception and what they see in context, which is kind of what the story's all about, then, you know, that does a lot of work for you. It also sets a sort of a tone that is expressionistic, which was very important to me as well. And it also allowed me to carry that expressionism into sound design, you know, play with the subjectivity versus objectivity all the time, always throw into question our perception. Like, what are we seeing? Is it the same? Is it static? Is our sense of someone's identity static, or is it shifting from one scene to the next?
And telling the story now in 2021, a story, you know, the novel came out in the 20s and the story is still set in the 20s. Like, did that require any, you know, major changes or evolutions to the story to kind of, you know, make a modern film about the period?
It was never my intention to make a period film, oddly. It is set in the 20s, and I think there's a certain amount of societal rigidity that comes with that I think is important for the story, but beyond those sort of social mores or whatever you want to call them, I didn't want to be beholden to making it a time capsule or sort of making it a kind of nostalgic museum piece or anything like that. And that was always a risk, given the black and white and the 4:3. You know, it was always a risk that those choices were going to look like I was making a homage to old films or something, and that's not really the intention. And I think a lot of that was countered with a a sort of delicacy around the language. I mean, yes, there are passages that are very specifically 1920s, but there are also I also took a lot of liberties. I think there was I was conscious of doing just enough, using phrases like rot and, slang words that felt very specifically period. But then you take like the sort of row scene, the pivotal big argument that happens between Irene and Brian towards the end of the movie. And that's littered with overlapping and quite a lot of modern phrases. So I was sort of a little playful with that deliberately.
Well, I want to congratulate you on the film, and thank you so much for talking with me about it. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Welcome to our Meet the Experts film writers panel. I'm here with Sian Heder from CODA, Roberto Bentivegna from House of Gucci, Fran Kranz from Mass, and Rebecca Hall from Passing. Now, you're all actually directors as well, either of the projects we're talking about today, or Roberto, I know you've directed other projects in your career. So I was wondering if there's, if the writing or directing side of filmmaking, which side inspires you the most creatively, or if it's a sort of an even balance. Let's start with Roberto.
Well, I think I always, maybe naively, but I always write thinking that maybe I might direct what I'm writing. And so I'm always injecting the writing with very specific visual details, and even things like, sound or lighting ideas, colors, things like that, just to kind of give the script a real sense of texture. And in this case, I think subconsciously I thought that maybe Ridley would direct it. And so, I just really kind of wanted to give it as much nuance as possible visually. But yeah, I don't think of the two things as separate. I mean, I think even if you just write to write, I think inevitably you're thinking visually, you're thinking in terms of cinema, hopefully,
I mean, I'll jump in. I feel like similarly, like whenever I am writing, I am playing through the movie that I would make of whatever I'm writing, even if I'm not intending to do it. And to the point that sometimes my action lines are ridiculous because I'm like, I know what the room looks like. Like I have the whole room in my head, and and I'm not taking the time to like get it all down on the page sometimes because the movie is living inside me in this other way. But I sort of, writing is so painful. I mean, it's amazing, but it's often painful and kind of, there's such different parts of you, at least for me, they are, and I think I'm always looking for ways to make writing a more communal experience, whether, like Fran said, it's bringing in actors to hear it and read it, or whether it's in my research process where I really use a lot of real people. And I'm, when I was writing CODA, I was in Gloucester and I was going around and going fishing with local guys to see how their boats worked, and, talking to the Gloucester Fishermen's Wives Association to get a sense of what those women were like. And so it's sort of like always looking for a way to bring what I love about directing into the writing process. And then when you're directing, sort of always having your writer brain working in the background where, editorial is a whole other rewriting process where I feel like in the edit, I make my movie again as though I'm coming at it completely with fresh eyes. So the two kind of speak to each other and play off each other in an interesting way.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really, obviously I've never done this before, so I don't have any other experiences to go on, but I can't imagine divorcing the writing from the direct. It was just my sort of way into working out how to be a director, was imagining the frame and imagining the shots. I ended up storyboarding a lot of the movie too. Like sort of out of necessity, because we were, a low budget tier 1, 23 days, like a lot of the films here, but like it, so there was a certain amount of trying to be as specific as possible, but every rewrite, every nuance was a sort of refinement along that journey to getting to that point of shooting it. But of course things, I'm an actor. I'm the first one to know that things change on set, and situations have to be flexible. And that's kind of joyful too, but it's also sort of knowing how to make that adaptation shift, into your benefit is a fun game too.
How about you, Fran?
Yeah, I think as an actor, I was so naive about directing, in the sense that, I was like crying at our rap party, thinking I'd accomplished something, and I had done nothing. There was so much work to do that feels like ages ago. So I have this whole kind of reverence for the journey and the process now, or sort of, real sort of respect. And so I feel like I'd probably give a different answer if I do make another movie, considering this was my first time. The writing, it was a sort of a lonely process. I would probably get actors involved more, and try to sort of be more collaborative, I guess, in that sense, because I found ultimately how useful they were, and their instincts. Good actors have great instincts, and so they led me. They revealed so much about the problems with my own writing, or what was needed, I felt. But yeah, it's tough because I knew I wanted to direct it, and that was sort of the dream. I just discovered, directing's a lot of work, a lot of responsibilities that I had not anticipated. So I feel like the next thing I write, I'm just curious myself how it will change the process, knowing what I'm in for, and the sort of the length and the scope of the journey, which I didn't fully realize when I was writing this.
Every scene will be interior day by a cozy fire.
And speaking of the writing process, writing can be sort of like a solitary kind of endeavor. Like, what's kind of the ideal kind of conditions for you, like, day to day, to kind of create the mental and physical space for your creativity, Roberto?
I wrote this in the least Gucci place possible, which was Manasota Key, Florida, in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. And I went kind of crazy because it's like a weird balance between, I feel like I need some sort of silence, but I also don't want to be completely detached from my life as I know it, from a sort of a city living situation. But I think generally, I have a very normal routine. I spend about 6 hours either researching or reading or writing, and then I absolutely have to throw myself into some sort of social situation because I like people a little bit generally. So I definitely don't want to sit in a room by myself and then also be by myself after that, so I think it's just a question of balancing. But for me, I think the treatment for me is the most important part of the process. It's like I have the complete freedom to really just explore anything on that page, and ideas come, I think, a lot through that, through the treatment. And then the script itself, once I've broken story in the treatment, actually it doesn't take me that long. But the treatment can be sort of the really tough part of the process for me.
Yeah, there's like a room up there that I wrote most of this in that just like hasn't, I don't know if it'll ever recover. It's like a mess. It looks like I just moved into it or something. I'm so curious. I heard about a novelist who leaves her home and drives on like this sort of fictitious 10-minute commute just to go back to her home to sort of separate work from home and sort of do her writing. So there's all these kind of bizarre things I guess people do to kind of find that space. Obviously sort of going away. I made some efforts to get away, like go on vacation with the script. I talked about it. It's like, felt like a new relationship where you're trying to like date and do sort of fun things together or something. But with a family, I wonder how to sort of manage it all and carve it out. This was obviously such an emotional writing experience that part of me felt, I sort of need to be for lack of a better word, sort of masochistic about it. And I kind of need to sit with this and immerse myself in these stories and feel these emotions in order to, honor the sort of the story I'm trying to tell and the real sort of communities or survivors and really try to put myself there. But going forward, I want to write. And so trying to have a more balanced life is a big question for me. So I'm glad you asked that. If I could carve out a few hours a day and then have force that social life aspect, get myself around people. I like people too. So that sounds like a very healthy way to approach it. Just to, minimize these little windows where you torture yourself.
I mean, I don't know. I am such a social person. And so it's, as I said, I think I'm always looking for ways, I love to write in the total cliche LA way of in the middle of a busy coffee shop where there's a lot happening around me. In a way, it's easier for me to be isolated with my thing when there's life around me. So that always worked better for me than being, alone in my house in a room. I liked being out in the world with my laptop somewhere. Of course, my first movie I wrote before I had children. So I was working in this very writerly way of, writing for a while and taking a walk and, going for a hike and mulling over the scene and then going back to write some more and then getting some coffee. And then at 3 a.m, having a great idea and getting up and sitting and working on my laptop. And, I had 2 small children when I was writing CODA. So it's hard to have that brain space where it's working at the back of your head. Cause I think there's the writing you're doing when you're sitting in front of your computer and you're actively writing. And then there's the writing when your brain is your subconscious is working out a problem in your script as you're doing something else. But I found that part of my brain doesn't work as well now that I'm a mom with small children who are constantly needing engagement. I'm not kind of working on what is that second act thing? I'm doing whatever insanity you're always doing when you have 2 little kids. So it's been a lot. I've had to become much more disciplined about, this is my work time. I'm locking myself in my office. I'm creating Home Alone style barricades up the stairs. So there's paint cans and things hitting my children if they try to get to me. But you have to do that. And then honestly, breaking it up with, like I said, real people are everything to me when I'm writing because it's the things that come out of those conversations. So sometimes if I'm working on something and it's instead of Googling it, I'll find a person to call to have a conversation about it. If it's what would the Coast Guard say if they're doing a Coast Guard boarding in the middle, out at sea? And instead of Googling that, I will find a coastie to call and have that conversation, because also I find that will lead to other creative ideas that I was never expecting. That'll lead to, oh, there's this other weird thing about being a coastie that, and suddenly you're oh, that could be a whole scene or that could be a whole. So I just engage with strangers a lot. Honestly, I'm always cold calling random people to talk, hey, could you talk to me for a second about what it's like to run a fish auction? And it might be a procrastination technique. I think it definitely is on one level, but it also gives me a lot.
Procrastination is very important.
Right? It is.
Crucial.
How about you, Rebecca?
I am actually perversely, given I've made a lifetime out of being an actor, intensely solitary and love it, and would happily paint and write and not see people for days on end. And I kind of have to be dragged out of that, to remember that there is life outside of those things. So I love writing, and I've always had a very I think my process is a lot of sort of wandering around and daydreaming and doing everything but the writing, but somehow it's going on, and then sitting down for, relatively short yet very intense bursts. But similarly to what you were saying, that all goes out the window when you have, as I do now, a 3-year-old. So it's it's sort of become this sort of dream of some sort of solitary artistic existence has completely gone out the window. I just finished a screenplay which was mostly written sat on the floor amidst a lot of Play-Doh and Legos. So, it's like I couldn't even get to the office. So I don't know. I'm slightly, I think sometimes I have to surprise myself with situations. Like I've done a lot of writing sort of in the back of car journeys on the way to jobs or things that were, if someone else is driving, then I suddenly find I can do lots of writing, which is very weird. But I think it's like a sort of a trick of, conning yourself into some environment that doesn't feel precious. It's like, so I don't know, who knows?
Well, I want to thank all of you for joining and talking to me about your work. It's also very specific and different, and so it's always a pleasure to talk about different people's writing and their processes. Thank you so much again. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.